learning the language of soul rather than the language of self. Self psychology is what we have. We don't have a soul psychology. We don't have a psychology. We have a selfology.
Welcome to Back to the Future podcast. My name is Victor Sadia, and I talk with brilliant minds and hearts of people who want to uproot and transform the current health and wellness paradigm. Francis Weller is a psychotherapist, writer, and expert on grief, blending depth psychology with ancient wisdom. Known for his book The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Weller emphasizes the importance of community, ritual, and nature in healing. His work advocates for embracing grief as a vital part of life, and so he has dedicated a lot of time to guide grief rituals amongst diverse communities. If we can't acknowledge the descent and the depths, how are we going to walk into this time that is upon us? In this episode, we explore the profound importance of acknowledging and embracing the darker side of our life as individuals, but also as civilization. Francis discusses how our culture's focus on ascension and progress often neglects the necessary and transformative experience of descent. He emphasizes that true healing and connection arise from engaging with the depths of our emotions, particularly with grief. And so, communal rituals are fundamental to deepen our relationship with life in all its levels and flavors. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Today we have Mr. Francis Weller. Francis, thank you so much for being here.
It's a real pleasure to be with you, Victor. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to begin by reading a short extract from my favorite Rumi poem, if you allow me to do so.
You can't go wrong starting with Rumi. So.
All day I think about it, and then at night I say it. Where did I come from, and what am I supposed to be doing? I have no idea. My soul is from elsewhere. I am sure of that. And I intend to end up there. This drunkenness began in some other tavern. When I get back around to that place, I'll be completely sober. I must say that this is probably my favorite poem in my life. And I'm very happy to be sharing it with you because I know it's also close to your heart. So why don't you tell me a little bit about this concept of sobriety and Rumi playing with that image?
Well, I think I can't tell you what Rumi thinks about that image, but what I gather is there's a term in their sorbet, that kind of communion experience in the Sufi tradition, and I think what he's actually speaking to is that capacity for deep presence. Sobriety is like being completely transparent to this moment so that what is, in a sense, emergent has a receptor site within us to be touched by the sacred, to be touched by the word sacred is kind of loaded. So let me just say to be touched by the aliveness of this moment. I think that's what Rumi is after, is that experience of aliveness.
When would you say that your moments of sobriety happen most often? Where are you when you feel sober in that sense?
That's a hard question. I don't know if there's a pattern to that, because there have been moments where I feel like grace has come upon me, undeserved, but somehow things part and you see things or you feel things so deeply that you know that there's a deeper presence to the whole cosmological dream. It's not just a mechanical system of atoms bouncing off of other atoms, but there's something quite magical and ordinary, in that moment. So it's more like grace comes. I don't feel like I work for it. I don't think you can plan that. In times of deep conversation, moments of beauty, deep vulnerability, those seem to be the times that something has a chance to break through my own density.
Was there a specific time in your professional career? I gather you are a psychotherapist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you've been practicing in the clinical setting for a while, correct?
42 years.
42 years. Was there a time in that trajectory where you knew that you could open yourself to be more receptive to that aliveness, that sacredness through your work? Or this is something that since the beginning you felt it was there and you just continued in that path, inviting it, but without forcing it, as you say?
I think it took some time to begin to sense that my job in the room wasn't to lead anything, but to be a good tracker. Where is soul taking us now? Into what hidden room, what, underground grotto, what subterranean place of imagination? So my job has been to track. Where is it? How is it moving? What does it want us to pay attention to in this conversation? So my job has been just to watch, to notice, and then to reflect back. This is what I see. This is what's present. So I don't feel like I lead anything. And it took a few years to get into that mode of just not trying to make something happen in the room. It doesn't work anyhow. So
yeah, let's talk about that, because as health professionals, I do believe there's this unconscious, even conscious also, like demand from health professionals to make things happen in the room. What must happen, or what happened to you that first you realize that it doesn't work even if you make things happen, and then that you sit back in a sense, and that's the best way to be a health professional?
For me, it was about letting go of the heroic ideal. See, in the heroic model, which has really impacted the clinical model, it's always about progress. It's always about improvement. It's always about getting stronger, mastery. All of these, the words in our language in psychotherapy in particular are quite heroic. So there's no room for falling, for dissent, for being lost. I mean, people come into my office and say, God, I think I regressed this week. And I say, wonderful. I wonder what this turnaround is taking us toward. Because in that model of constant progression and growth, that's another big word in the clinical setting is growth. Well, nature doesn't do it that way. The only thing that does, I think, is a cancer cell. So where are the moments of fallowness, of decay, of darkness? And to begin to imagine that as equally holy to anything that we ascend to in the light. And we become so binary and good and bad and right and wrong and up is good and down is bad. Well, soul takes us down all the time into the depths, into our grief, into our feelings of inadequacy and lostness and tenderness. And, those are not heroic territories. So I think one of the first things that I had to let go of was that in that pursuit of improvement, making my patients improve was so freeing. Begin to see, oh no, I've never seen anyone go in a linear process. It's more like a wild, chaotic dance of up and down and backwards and sideways and still. People complain about being stuck, and I say, wonderful. This must be the spot. We have to dig here. Psyche won't let you move on from this place. So learning the language of soul rather than the language of self. Self-psychology is what we have. We don't have a soul psychology. We don't have a psychology. We have a self. And that one's all about improvement based on the premise that who I am is not good enough to belong. So I have to undergo this constant, chronic self-improvement project to make myself at least tolerable for inclusion, So a lot of our psychology is driven by a failure of the collective, of the culture, to welcome our people.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the anti-hero and how, I find myself now like in that place where a few things in my life are now being questioned with a huge amount of voices, that I don't want to give more important to one voice than to the other. But still, there's this expectation of mine to be the hero and to solve it and to come up the other side, whatever adjective you want to put there. And by listening to you, I say, and what about if I choose to be the anti-hero and just let things happen without me having to anticipate what is happening, what will happen on the other side, which probably there's no even other side, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, on one hand is the self-improvement model. The other hand isn't opposing that. The other hand is learning to be in relationship to soul and to work with soul when it brings depression or addiction or sadness or whatever it brings to us. So we're not talking about any kind of passivity. It takes a great deal. Jung would say that any psychic change takes a great deal of effort. So we're still working, but not trying to direct the change into this state of perfection. But really, I think the goal isn't perfection, but wholeness. And And that's even a loaded word. I don't know if any of us ever get to that state, but at least becoming somewhat more of a friend in the depths and being able to work in relationship to soul. And soul is not easy. It doesn't hang out in the brighter neighborhoods. It tends to go down into the dark, into the difficult territories. But that's where we're also most human, right? And when we talk about having a deep conversation, that's because we've set aside the heroic, I've got this, I'm in control. No, when we actually come to places of confession with one another to say, I feel lost, man. I feel so brokenhearted right now. I don't know how I'm going to get through this day. What I see happening around me and breaking my heart. Now we're in the territory where soul has a chance to then help inform us about how to respond meaningfully to these times.
And I'm thinking that even language is more on the light side in the sense, because it's putting words to things. And the darkness and the dark is speechless in a sense. It's language. It's not, once you put language, you're giving it a bit of an explanation, a definition, some sort of clarity. Whereas in the dark, to explain the dark is even, I don't know. What do you think about putting a lot of words in those dark stances where we're at and we're most human?
I think the language of darkness is quite different. It's whispers, it's sighs, it's touch. It's more of a hands and knees kind of thing than it is trumpeting out our brilliant ideas and conceptions. We're entering what I'm calling the long dark as a species, as a planet. Not just the species, but the whole planet is entering what I'm calling the long dark, which is a prolonged period of descent. And in that space, all of our words, all of our ideas are kind of glaringly showing us that that's not going to be what gets us through, if anything. So what are the protocols? What are the etiquettes of darkness? Well, silence, listening, humility, not knowing. Those are the values. Those are the qualities that accompany the dark. We talk differently outside at night than we do in the bright of the day, So there's a different kind of intimacy that comes out of language or out of gestures, more ritual than it is oratory, So learning. We don't know much about the dark. In the heroic drive, it's all about ascension. It's always about rising up. We get really panicked when things begin to go down. We have many industries designed to make sure things keep rising. But we don't know about the descent as profoundly necessary. The alchemists were the last ones that really celebrated the descent in the process they called the negredo, the blackening. And that was the beginning stage of all soul work, was in the negredo. They said that the work of soul making couldn't even begin until there was an adequate amount of darkness, what they called the putrefactio, the mortifactio. Aren't these great terms? And so that's dignified now. The shame, the losses, the inadequacies, the loneliness, that's all in the vessel. And that's what begins the work. It doesn't condemn the work. It actually is what soul is generated from in this imagination. So I love the work of alchemy as a way of reclaiming the whole territory that soul occupies.
Thank you. What has happened to you when you are sharing this, I think, beautiful and deep concept of the long dark, when you are invited to conferences, podcasts, communities? How are people responding to this? Because in a sense, at least for me, it's like, yes, thank you for putting a word in what we're all feeling. But at least in my sense, it's like, it still feels like, okay, let's go in the dark for a while and then we'll reemerge on the light. And that's not what you're meaning. It's like really surrender to it. How is people responding to you when you are offering this image, this concept, this way of naming this planetary process?
Well, as you would expect, it's mixed. I just gave a large talk in Salt Lake City a few months ago, and it was called Facing the World with Soul. And we talked a lot about the long dark and about descent. And there were so many people who came up to me afterwards who said, thank you for that language. They're therapists, but no one talks about the descent. It's always, again, about rising and improving and strengthening. Those aren't bad things at all. They're beautiful. But without this other syncopation that's part of soul life, if we can't acknowledge the descent and the depths, man, how are we going to walk into this time that's upon us? It isn't going to be information that's going to save our butts. It's not going to be, the next technology. There's something deeper. It has to, as Wendell Berry, that wonderful poet farmer, said, it all turns on affection. So what I'm hoping for in the long dark is the rekindling of a heart aroused, of a heart feeling its grief and love for the world. And maybe through affection, we might respond, in the coming decades, or it's probably going to be a couple generations of difficult time. So how do people respond? With the recognition that something is being named, what I like about the term long dark as opposed to the poly crisis or the various languages is that this invites imagination. It invites a soul rendering of where are we, rather than looking at all these critical things or economics or environment or social justice. Oh my God, all of that pouring together. But I'm thinking that the long dark is actually a necessity, that the ascent process of civilization has got us to this edge of disaster, of collapse. And it's as if the immune response of the planet is speaking up and drawing us down back into silence. There's a wonderful term in the Inuit language, kartsaluni. And kartsaluni translates sitting quietly together in the dark, waiting expectantly for something creative to emerge. I think that's kind of our guideline for the coming period. We have to get quiet and listen. What is the dreaming earth trying to get our attention?
Yeah.
What does she want us to do and respond in a way that is much more mutual and reciprocal and entangled with the world?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love how you put the long dark in opposition, or at least as another offering to the word polycrisis, which we've heard a lot, in which it does not invite imagination in the same sense, because we know what poly and what crisis means, and so we think we can get to understand how this crisis is evolving, which I don't think we certainly can. At the same time, it's not only about the name, but also the timing. There's this phrase by Bayo Akomolafe who says, "Times are urgent, let us slow down."
Yeah.
And the long dark, and I love the word long, because it's not only dark, it is also long. And that's something that we, with this cult of speed and productivity and being at odds with, the time is now, live at the fullest and try to prolong life as much as possible and forget about death because, whatever, or try to negate death. The long dark, it's like, I don't even know how long is long.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, that's the reality of the times we're in. We don't know. We have all the information we need. We know how high the CO2 levels have gotten in the atmosphere. We know the numbers of elephants still remaining. We know how much clear cut is left, or how much forest is left from clear cut. But we don't know. So the long dark, it's kind of insulting to our ideas of control and dominion. I'm thinking probably multiple generations. I will not see the other side of the long dark. I won't be alive. I don't imagine it's going to be less than 50 years of real difficult time. And certainly beauty and love and friendship and kissing and, holding babies and all those things. Yes, that'll still go on, I hope. But what I have to do now is throw seed. My job now is to throw as many seeds as possible of what living culture might look like, because that's the only thing I think that's going to get us back into some kind of reciprocal relationship with the earth is living culture, because living culture understands the intimate relationship between the community and the ecosystems that support it. So that's where you get back into a ritual-based life. You get back into a scale that responds to not only the human need, but the more than human world,
Yeah, and that's a powerful world, at least in the West, where rituals of healing are, in a sense, sequestered by this allopathic model of health, of medicalizing everything, and of controlling physiology, and in a sense also controlling psychology. But ritual, it's a huge thing. And I would love to hear a bit from you on how, like, I imagine you went to high school, you went to college, studied psychology, started practicing, but then ritual from other veins of civilization came to you and said, okay, this is something I can explore. What rituals were the first rituals that you lived that opened opportunities for you, and how are you inviting ritual to your professional work?
I first encountered genuine ritual in the mid 90s through various, maybe a little earlier, early 90s. Then I studied for a year with Malidoma Some and Sobonfu Some, and went to his village in Africa. And it wasn't that I wanted to do those rituals, but I saw the power of ritual. Because we can't just import somebody else's ritual practice, because our psyches have been shaped by different factors, and ritual has to respond to the shape the psyches are in. But what I saw during that time was the powerful necessity of a ritual-based life, both doing individual rituals, but the power of communal ritual. I mean, I remember being at a continuing education class that I have to take, a certain number of hours every 2 years.
To get your recertification.
Yes, to keep my license active. And I was at a class by Rick Hansen, he wrote Buddha's Brain and Resilience, and he's a neuropsychologist, and he's done all this wonderful research on Buddhist studies and practices and its role in psychological health. And I'm listening to him and teaching us all these different beautiful meditations and practices. But then I was thinking, well, for several 100,000 years, ritual was the means by which the community helped you re-regulate after a trauma, after an event, after a death. That was the means by which we were recalibrated back to some sense of okayness. And we don't have that anymore. So we rely entirely upon either medication or some deeply interior practices. Again, please hear me. I value these practices immensely. I'm so glad we have them. But what I've seen from leading probably at 100 grief rituals over the past 20 some odd years, 25 years, is how powerful that is to the psyche to be in a communal setting in which we are addressing this piece, and everyone is invited to bring their grief to the ground and do that side by side. Oh my God. I can't tell you how many times at the end of the ritual, somebody will say, I've never done anything like that before in my life, but it was oddly familiar. So what is that in the psyche? Again, Jung's idea of what he called the unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. So this ritual is part of that unforgotten wisdom. It's shaped us over so long a period, so that when we get near that resonant field, some part of us lights up and goes, that's what I've been waiting for. That's the thing I've been needing. I can't do this by myself. I can't grieve all my grief by myself. It needs a larger holding space. So, that's what I began to see. And most of the people I see in my practice, I say something like, this is a good place to start. This is a good place for you to learn how to tolerate contact in those most vulnerable places. But ultimately, you'll need a larger holding space, because that's what your psyche has been waiting for. And I don't tell that to everybody, but the vast majority of people that I've worked with in my practice ultimately end up coming to do some communal grief work. And it's like years of work in those times of being together.
I just remember how I got in touch with your work. A friend of mine sent me a podcast interview with you. I was in the beach in the last December on vacation, and basically I was running in the beach, and I heard your voice talking about grief and grieving. I then bought your book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, which I've read 3 times, I think, or 4 times now, and that invited me to try. Not to talk about grief, but to practice grief in a collective setting, and to, quote unquote, guide grieving rituals without much experience. I mean, I've led some retreats, but never allowed myself to go into a grieving ritual. And I've done two or three so far, and it's been amazing. And this is something I want to talk to you, because even like the people who come to you and say, I have never done something like this, but it feels really familiar. And in your work, when you invite people to try and do it themselves without, get this certification, please buy it from me, it's $999, but if you buy in the next 10 minutes you'll get 50 off. It's not you trying to sell anything. You say, just go with your intuition. And that's what I've done. And the same, and people the same way respond from their intuition. Tell me about your first grieving ritual that you led. How did you feel before and after? Because I think the first one is important, right? It's when you step
Oh,
into
sure.
a different place. Yeah.
Before I respond to that, let me just say it is important to have some basic understanding of group dynamics, containment, the movement of power and authority in the room. It's important to have some of that ground. So we're not just free fall as we go into these spaces, because those spaces can become incredibly intense, very, very intense. So I had been leading groups and stuff for years prior to the first grief ritual. So I had some understanding of group dynamic. The first one, let's see, it was 1998, 99. And I was doing it with two other friends of mine, Rob and David. And we didn't do any kind of preparation. We just kind of said, we're going to do a grief ritual now, because there was some of that in the atmosphere. And it was a men's event, and we could feel it. The men were carrying a lot of grief. So we just basically set up the space for it and conducted it as best we could. But then I realized that this needs more containment, needs more context. So I began starting 3-day gatherings, because it looks like to me, particularly being a white man on this continent, our grief is so tight and so compacted that it felt like we needed to loosen the material, like composting, turning the stuff over. So we began using writing practices and singing and movement and drums, and to kind of get the body loosened. So I've learned a lot over the years about how to create spaces, particularly for folks who, by and large, have never stepped off the edge of that. In fact, they've avoided that edge until they couldn't avoid it anymore. Their child dies, or a friend commits suicide, or all these things that come into our life and shatter the complacency or the sense of I've got this all under control, and that's where we need to meet.
Yeah, thank you. The first time for me was very similar. We were in a retreat that I was co-leading only for men, and it was a 5-day event. And the grief ritual was scheduled to happen on the second day. And I was very happy that I was, that was going to happen. But then the atmosphere wasn't ready. And that was the only activity which changed on this schedule. And it was postponed day by day, because through the meditations, conversations, writing down, dances, and whatever, it didn't feel quite right. And then the last day, the last morning, was the moment where this could happen, and it was beautiful, and I'm very happy that you're telling me this, because I can observe how the first day that it got postponed, it wasn't clear to me that it had to be postponed. It was just a decision that we had to take in the moment. But then when it happened, I said, this is exactly how it should happen. So it opens this invitation to this full presence that we began talking about. And as a retreat leader or guide, because I don't like those words, just as facilitator or whatever, I always try to be very horizontal. I think that deep presence and that intuition, like the first time with you guys, it was like, we didn't prepare a lot. We said, we're going to do it, right? Because it was intuitively, you were ready, even though you didn't prepare it. It wasn't on the schedule. You didn't have candles, or you were by the fire, right? So yeah, thank you for saying that. And in that sense, my invitation, because I received your invitation from you, is that people approach these spaces. Because as you said, these were seminal to our civilization for thousands of years. This is what has us here today. And we feel the lack of it, and we feel like a hollow space that it's there. And I think these collective practices are, at least in the West, very needed.
I think they are indispensable. I mean, they were the practices by which the inevitable encounters with loss and trauma were held. And so you knew on some level that whatever happened to you, there would be a response. That's not how you feel nowadays. That's why we have insurance policies instead of communal policies. We live anxiously on the edge that, well, what if I break a leg? What if, I get COVID? What if, and we kind of stumble through the world that way without that felt sense of the covering, that the communal covering is there. And if I get hurt, food will come to the house. My leg will be cared for, and so that absence, the emptiness in that space is profound. I think that's actually, I gave a talk a while back called At the Heart of All Our Sorrows. And what I came to was that what drives, excessive consumption, what drives systemic racism, what drives economic injustice, all of these things are driven in some ways by the emptiness of white civilization, that we've lost all of those foundational pieces like ritual, like community, like traditions and practices that sustain the coherence of the community. And in that absence, we try to fill it up with every possible thing, like new cars and cell phones and massive bank accounts. But we can never fill that emptiness with secondary satisfactions. We have to go back to the primary satisfactions that shaped us over several 100,000 years. Those practices are what allowed us to endure. And without them, we have what we have.
Yeah.
A civilization that's basically eating itself to death.
Yeah. And these collective practices do speak in other languages. It's not just that I'm with you, I will care for you, I love you with the words, but with the body. That's the language where the body really knows that it's cared for. And it's physical touch and hearing a person, crying or even wailing. It goes to our deep tissues. And that's something that there's not enough spaces in Western urban life to talk through those somatic practices. And it's not even invited. It's like, how can you cry in public, right? And just crying, which is like the most superficial of it all, when you would like to scream and to really use your body to express, or not to express, but to really feel what you're feeling. Yeah,
absolutely. No, we don't. We have emphasized self and we've emphasized spirit. So you can go across the country and you can find a meditation center, a yoga center. These spirit-centered, focused places are everywhere. But try to find something based on soul. It's really rare, really rare. And you understand what I'm saying in the sense the spirit is that rising and ascending tradition, beautiful, exquisite, peak experience, the heights, the clarity, the vision, while soul is the descending movement down into the depths. They need each other. Spirit without soul can become so detached and so kind of unmoved by the suffering of others. But soul without spirit can become so mired in the heaviness and the denseness of life that it can become overwhelming. So the soul people like me, I need spiritual practices. And the spirit folks need soul. So there's some ballast, some ground to their understanding of what it means to be a human being. And it isn't about transcendence and rising above, but really engaging the full measure. Soul came here for full participation, and nothing is foreign to soul. Every experience we have is part of the soul.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you for clarifying that terminology you use, which I think it's so deep. And also, as you say, nothing lies outside of soul. Even like you are not a serious person, you're also a joyous person, and you work with humor and you work with laughter because it's also part of it. And that's something that like people tend to. I tended to think, oh, this is just a serious thing, but dance is as primordial as this collective wailing and laughing too and dancing together. So how and again, it's not even a control thing. It's not, oh, now I'm going to say a joke so that people can laugh and just make this a bit more lighter. It's just that it happens, and that's amazing to watch, right?
Yeah.
To see that it emerge, and you can get to that point where even laughter and crying and sobbing. I had an experience like this a few months ago. Like it happened at the same time. Like I didn't know that that was possible, right?
Well, I think that's the beauty of what we're talking about is how do we help any of us come into a place of unself-conscious living? Because when we go, even, I mean, we joke about this a little bit at the grief retreats, that one of the things that'll probably stop you from grieving is self-consciousness. And you'll be, well, I'm not crying as good as she is, or boy, they wrote that piece much better than I. So eventually, with enough repetition, people come to these repeatedly, or even after you've done some of the grief work, that self-consciousness begins to fade, and then laughter is inevitable. Tears are inevitable because you're not monitoring yourself to behave within the spectrum of approvability, but you're just being. Again, back to that presence, just, I mean, that's what I love about the grief work is that invariably at the end of the ritual, we are howling with laughter. Joy has invaded the room and taken us all hostage. It's quite wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah, I've experienced that too. And it's like the first time it happened, it was like, how the hell this is happening? And because I was hugging a person who has a long trajectory of being in places like this, it was the most natural thing for him that we were laughing. After that happened, it was like, oh no, 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 right. This is what should happen. This is wow. And still, when you are fully present, you are not expecting it to happen. Or, oh, this time I didn't laugh. Oh, something must have happened that it wasn't good enough this time.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you brought that last piece up there, Victor, because it's hard to grieve on demand. Okay, now it's 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon. Let's do it. However, even if it's not your day to grieve, you're needed. So, with the very beginning of our retreats, we start talking about village mind. That after the first opening circle, where everyone has shared a thread of grief, I'll say, did anyone share a grief you couldn't relate to? And of course, you can relate to it. And you may not have had that. You may not have had your child die or, someone die by suicide or whatever. But we're all in the communal territory of loss and sorrow. So I begin talking about these are our sorrows. It's not a collective of 30 separate sorrows, but it's the communal cup now that we're working with. And the idea of village mind means even if I don't grieve at the time when we're going to do the ritual, somebody else might grieve it, and I will feel that. So it's I love watching the synergy of that. That I come away changed even if I didn't grieve because we wept. The village wept. And that's the beauty of repetition with ritual is that I know next time it'll probably be me on the floor and you'll be there holding me when I grieve. So that ecology of sacred, that is what ritual is. There's a deep understanding of the necessity of every participant. There's no spectators in ritual. We're not there to see what I can get from it, but what can we create from this. So that kind of thinking is also very difficult for white Westerners to get their minds around is the we. That's what we need to be serving as the community, not so much the self.
Yeah.
Not abandon the self, but yeah.
Yeah. And, I've promoted a lot these group sessions, group clinical settings where I'm not talking about grieving ritual, but just diabetic patients coming together in a circle, or cancer patients, or cardiovascular patients. And this is exactly what happens. Like this is our thing, and part of our disease, or our identity of the disease, is this um, closeted, like we are behind a closet where we cannot talk about our emotions because whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also part of diabetes, right? It's amazing how bringing people together in a diabetics group, we begin talking about food and how to purchase food at the market and not at the supermarket or whatever, and we end up talking about feelings, emotions, and what diabetes feels like. And
Yeah.
that's even more healing that learning how to eat correctly,
Right.
right?
Right. I mean, good point. When I'm working with the Cancer Help Program, which I do a couple times a year here in California, when we start working in the group, there's eight participants. We don't talk about cancer that much. We talk about the unlived life. We talk about grief, and we talk about all those untended parts, that are now demanding attention. So yeah, it's how much we neglect our heart and bodies and souls. Of course, that's going to speak to us quite loudly in terms of the symptoms. Yeah.
Thank you, Francis. I changed my state when you talked at the beginning of, we don't need to be the heroes. And I let myself, like, in a sense, be more relaxed in this podcast, not trying to get to any specific point, which I loved, because we talked about so many things, but it didn't feel like I was just here.
Good.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. What if we could live more that way? Hmm?
Yeah.
The
And that's the
ritual of
beautiful
life.
thing. This is Monday morning. The week is just starting.
There you go.
And still, like, it also feels like the week is ending in a sense, because we have this feeling of completeness and of I'm satisfied. When Monday is a day of unsatisfaction, it's just, all your things are to will happen. You're anxious, and now it's like, yes, those things will happen, but at the same time, they're already happened because I'm here. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, my friend.
That's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
likewise. Thank you. I honor and respect you and your work and your words. I love your poetry, and I feel held by you, and knowing that you are doing what you're doing in another part of the continent. I just feel held. So thank you for doing it.
Well, that's beautiful. Thank you for your blessing.
Thank you, my friend.
Take care.
Take care. We'll be in touch, I'm sure.
Okay.